So the first topic we're going to talk about is kind of fits in a strange place. It's a little bit about, so we're talking about ecology, and we're talking about how living things interact with each other. And one type of interaction that living things have is when they have a very close relationship in which they live, they depend on one another, they live in or on one another, and we call these types of relationships symbiotic relationships, and there's sort of three categories. You might remember back from 7th grade, we did talk about these briefly. And so one type of this symbiotic relationship is mutualism. And in mutualism, the relationship between the two organisms is one in which both of the organisms benefit from the relationship. So, some examples of this. Termites. So, if you ever heard of new seats, yeah, Jake. New seats. Termites, as you probably know, eat wood. They're really bad if you get them in your house. They can destroy sort of the structure of your house and so forth. But termites actually on their own can't digest wood. So they have a mutualistic relationship. They have inside of their gut a tiny little protist, a microscopic protist. That's what's actually doing the digesting of the wood. So the termite chews up the wood, swallows it, goes into their digestive tract, and then this protist can produce the enzymes to break down that wood. And so they both benefit from this relationship. So the termite absorbs nutrients from that digested wood. The protist gets transportation, gets protected by the termite. The termite goes and finds the food source. So they're both benefiting from this. In 7th grade, we talked about the Nile crocodile and the Egyptian plover. The bird walks into the crocodile's mouth, pecks around in there. And what's happening is the bird and the crocodile have a symbiotic relationship. The bird gets a little meal by picking little bits of food out of the crocodile's teeth, and the crocodile gets clean teeth. You see this sometimes with birds as well that live in close proximity to mammals, and they like perch on them. They pick little insects out of their fur. Same sort of relationship. So this is mutualism. Both organisms are getting something positive out of the relationship. Another type of relationship is called commensalism. And in commensalism, one organism is benefiting again, but the other organism is not really affected either way. It's not harmed, but it's also not helped. It's just unaffected, really. So a common example we talk about is a barnacle and a whale. So barnacles attach to a whale's skin, and they sort of hitch a ride on the whale. As the whale's swimming through the water, the barnacles can filter out of the water little bits of food and little particles. So they get a ride, they get food, but it doesn't hurt the whale, it doesn't have any negative impact. The whale's unaffected. So here you can see some barnacles on the fin of the whale. Flip right away. So that's commensalism. The third type is one you're probably most familiar with, parasitism. So in parasitism, again, one organism benefits, but in this case, the other organism is harmed. The parasite is the organism that benefits, and the host organism, there's some negative effects. So this is a lamprey, these long fish. They're very primitive fish. They're jawless fish, which were the first fish to evolve. And they have this mouth, they have these very, very sharp ring-like teeth on their tongue. It almost looks like a drill bit. The tongue has teeth on it. What they do is they almost act kind of like a leech. So they're not leeches. Leeches are worms. These are fish. But they attach to the side of large fish. They sort of bore a hole into them with their tongue. And then they obtain nutrients by digesting the blood of that fish. So here's a lake trout, has 2 lamprey attached to it. Sometimes you catch big fish in big lakes, you might see, sometimes they might still have a lamprey attached. Other times you could see the scar from where a lamprey was once attached. Obviously that's a parasitic relationship. The lamprey's benefiting, is getting this food source, but the fish can be harmed. It's losing nutrients, those wounds can become infected and so forth. A tick burrowing into the skin of an animal. Okay, that is a parasitic relationship. Tapeworms that get into the digestive tract of animals, absorbing nutrients, but they harm the host animals. So that's an example of parasitism. Any questions about these 3 types of symbiosis? All right. So we're going to move on to talk about materials cycles. So in all ecosystems, the materials, the matter that makes up the living organisms in the non-living environment is recycled. Now this is different from energy. We just finished talking about energy flow. When we're thinking about energy in an ecosystem, ecosystems must have a constant source of incoming energy. In most cases, what is that source? Yeah, the sun. And then producers can use that energy. Herbivores eat the producers, carnivores eat the herbivores, and so forth. But that energy is not recycled. It's used up in the daily activities of those organisms. Okay? You need a constant source of energy to maintain the ecosystem. These materials, however, are recycled. Okay? They change form. They get used by living things. They go into the non-living parts of the ecosystem, but they're recycled over and over again. Decomposers are one of the most important organisms in an ecosystem because they help this process to take place. Decomposers take the material that was in living organisms or in waste products or organic matter and return it back to the soil so it can be reused again. So some of the common materials that we talk about in terms of cycling of materials are water, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and we'll just look at some diagrams that show how these things are cycled through the ecosystem. The water cycle is one that we're probably pretty familiar with. Right? There's a finite amount of water, okay, in an ecosystem on the earth, and it constantly goes through these transformations. So if we think about, let's say, in the atmosphere, we'll start in the atmosphere. There's water vapor in the atmosphere. Okay. And when it condenses and falls to the earth as precipitation, as snow or sleet or rain, and it reaches the earth, several things can happen to it. Okay. Some of it can infiltrate deep into the ground and become part of our groundwater. Okay. Other parts of that precipitation goes into rivers and streams, goes into lakes, goes into oceans. Some of that water is absorbed by plants, by producers. They use it during photosynthesis and then release it back into the atmosphere. That stored water evaporates, returning it back to the atmosphere, and then it can fall back to the earth again. So we have this recycling of material. Have you ever seen, they sell them certain places, like a little glass globe, and it has like a plant and a little snail in there sometimes, and it's all sealed up. And it stays, all the organisms stay living because they have these nutrient cycles. The water used by the plant condenses on the side of that container, falls back into the soil. And so because these materials are recycled, it's sort of a self-contained tiny little ecosystem. Carbon is another material. Carbon makes up the majority of all living things. It's the most abundant element in living things is carbon. And so carbon can be found in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, can be found in the tissues of living organisms. It's used during respiration, or it's released during respiration. It's used during photosynthesis. And so this carbon goes through these cycles. Plants absorb it. When herbivores eat the plants, they gain carbon. Carnivores eat the herbivores, they gain carbon. When these organisms go through respiration, they're releasing it back into the atmosphere. When they die and decompose, that releases this carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. So you have this constant cycling of carbon in the ecosystem. Nitrogen follows a fairly complex cycle as well. Most of our atmosphere is actually nitrogen. So the atmosphere of the Earth is about 78% nitrogen. However, most living things can't actually use that nitrogen. For example, we need nitrogen in our bodies, but we can't get it by inhaling nitrogen. Our lungs don't absorb that nitrogen. But there are some, even most plants can't directly use that nitrogen that's in the atmosphere. But there are bacteria. They're called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They live in the soil. They live in the roots of plants. And they can actually take nitrogen from the atmosphere and fix it, turn it into a form the plants can use. Nitrite, nitrate, ammonia, and then the plants can absorb that nitrogen. Animals can get nitrogen by eating the plants, and other animals eat other animals to get their nitrogen. So again, when these organisms decompose, decomposers release that nitrogen back into the soil, so it can be recycled. Phosphorus follows the same sort of pattern. Okay, where you have phosphorus entering the soil, used by plants, animals gain phosphorus by consuming the plants, and so forth. This material cycles throughout the ecosystem. All right, if you imagine our courtyard ecosystem here, let's say they stop mowing that for the next 100 years or so. You come back to Perry Junior High in 100 years. What's it going to look like in that courtyard?
Grass will be really tall.
Will it be grass?
No.
No?
Yeah.
Yeah?
I don't know.
What do you think?
Yeah.
It'll still be grass in there?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone disagree?
Mr. Duros, we'll be dead in 100 years.
Nah, you can make it maybe.
No.
Who knows what technology brings out?
Yeah. I don't know about that, Mr. Duros.
Matt?
Would it just be more like trees?
Would it be trees? Yeah, probably would be. In our area, if an ecosystem is left undisturbed, is left undisturbed, okay, a process called succession starts. Succession is when the ecosystem sort of changes over time. And grasses and so forth, yeah, there'll be grasses for a long time. But what will start to grow there after maybe, a couple years? Yeah, some like bushes, some woody plants start to grow. Maybe some trees, seeds land in there and start to grow. And then over time, that ecosystem starts to change. In our area, if an ecosystem is left undisturbed, it eventually forms a forest. Okay? So if you left that, probably turns into a forest eventually. In our immediate area, it's usually a beech, birch, maple forest is our, what we call climax community. If you just leave an ecosystem undisturbed, most likely returns to that state. So this process is called succession, this change in the community over time. One set of species replace another until a stable sort of final ecosystem is reached. Now when it reaches this climax community stage, it doesn't mean the trees and organisms live forever, but when they do die, they're replaced usually with similar organisms. Even ponds go through a process of succession where sediment builds up and they fill in over time until eventually a pond can be completely filled in can turn into a forest. Can bare rock form an ecosystem?
Yeah.
What are the first kinds of things that can actually live on the bare rock? Moss and lichens, things like that, yeah. So even from bare rock, lichens are like if you were to look at a rock, or if you go hiking the Adirondacks or something, you go to top of a mountain that's basically bare, and you can just see the bedrock. You can see this little sort of flaky organism called lichen can actually just grow on bare rock. Mosses could start to grow on rock. And as those organisms grow and eventually die and decompose, a very tiny thin layer of soil starts to build up. And once some of that soil builds up, larger plants can start to take hold. And as they decompose, the soil builds up even further. And so you have this process where you can go from bare rock all the way up to a full mature ecosystem. Now it takes a long time, but it does take place. That's called primary succession, when it starts from bare rock and goes to an ecosystem. The other type of succession is called secondary succession. This is when you already had an ecosystem, you already had soil built up, but because of some disturbance, a mudslide, a forest fire, or something like that, there's been a disturbance, which kind of resets things, and then succession can start to take place. Now in our area, it is that beech, birch, maple forest, but depending on your location, it might be other ecosystems. If you go just north of us, or if you go to higher elevations, the climax community is more of a spruce forest, okay, an evergreen forest. Okay. If you go to the Midwestern parts of the United States, the climax community is a grassland. We call these sort of regions where certain ecosystems form biomes. So if we look at this map of the Earth, where we are, we would be right here, obviously. And so that is, it's a little hard to tell the difference in these colors, but that's the temperate deciduous forest. That's where we live. If we go to the Midwest U.S., okay, that's where we have the grassland. If we go to the southwest parts of the United States, we end up with deserts. Okay? If we go up in Canada, we get the conifer forest. If we go farther, we get to the tundra. Now, why do different ecosystems form, these biomes, in different places? Why do we live in the temperate deciduous forest and not the tundra? What are the factors that determine these biomes? Well,
Climate?
yeah, climate. Two main factors. What are the two main factors of climate?
Altitude and how close you are to water.
Yeah, so moisture and temperature. Altitude is sort of indirectly related to temperature. So yeah, moisture and temperature are the two main factors that determine which ecosystem is going to form in a given area. So we have a relatively moderate temperature. We're not too cold, not too hot. And we have relatively high levels of precipitation. Puts us in the temperate forest. If you go and you have warmer temperatures and about the same amount of water, we get into the tropical seasonal forest. If you go warmer in temperature and even more precipitation, that's what forms the tropical rainforest. Going to the other end, as we get colder and less moisture, we get into the tundra. We go warmer and very low moisture, we get into the desert ecosystem. So the climatic conditions determine which biomes form. And here are the main biomes. Probably most you're familiar with: the desert, the tundra, grassland, deciduous forest, taigas like the coniferous forest, and then the tropical rainforest. And just have some information about each of them. They each have sort of their own species that are commonly live there. They're found in specific parts of the earth. Okay? And so you can see a little bit about them. And then our last topic, biodiversity. Our state lab that we do is related to biodiversity. as you guys told me in our question today, biodiversity is the number of different species that are living in an area. And typically what we associate with a high biodiversity is a more stable ecosystem. If we have a wide variety of living species in an area, often that area will be more resistant to disturbances, to changes, to diseases, and so forth. Because you have many living things in that ecosystem, the likelihood that one can or more can survive a disturbance is higher. If we have a low biodiversity, if you imagine like a soybean field that's hundreds of acres, actually be a really big soybean field, but if you have acres and acres of soybean, that's a very low biodiversity. If one disease or one pest were to come in, it could completely wipe out that entire ecosystem. And so typically a higher biodiversity means a higher level of stability. The problem is that humans are causing the extinction of species at an alarming rate. There's recently a paper released a month or so ago sort of detailing the rate at which species are becoming extinct. And it is much higher than even anybody imagined, especially due to climate change. As we change the Earth's climate, due to the buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we are endangering many, many species, and that's a problem. So when species become extinct, we're reducing biodiversity, and it's irreversible. When a species is gone, there's no bringing it back. And so that has some negative effects. We learned about these trophic cascades when we talked about wolves in Yellowstone. Here's another example. It happened with mountain lions as well. But taking one species away can have unexpected and unpredicted effects throughout the ecosystem. The lower the biodiversity, the more likely diseases are to spread. Also, humans find valuable resources in the species of the earth. Some medications have been found in the tropical rainforest, some cancer medications, for example. They're first discovered in the trees in the tropical rainforest, where they were identified and then synthesized to produce medications actually used to treat cancer today. And so by reducing that biodiversity, we risk the loss of those things. We measure biodiversity in a couple ways. One of these ways is through measuring the species richness of an ecosystem. This is a very simple measurement. It's basically how many different species live in the area, just counting. Okay, there's 50 different species in this courtyard. Its species richness would be 50. But sometimes that's not the best means of examining the biodiversity of an ecosystem. Because if you look at, in this example, community 1 and community 2, they have the same species richness. Each has 4 species living in it. But are they the same? When you look at them, what would you say is the difference between these two communities? When you look at the actual biodiversity. Evan?
Community 1, there's more that have a little bit of everything, and community 2 has more of one than all the others.
Yeah, community 2, good. Exactly. Even though they have the same species richness, one species dominates community 2. 70% of the trees are these. Whereas in community 1, they're much more evenly spread. So community 1 would probably, you would imagine, has a higher stability and resiliency. So what we're looking at here is species evenness. In fact, there's not just how many different species there are, but also how evenly spread the numbers of those species are, the populations are. So we often will use a formula to calculate the species evenness. This is one that's called the Simpson Diversity Index. We look at the total number of individuals in the area, and then how many individuals are in each species. You can calculate this index that tells you the biodiversity, including species evens. So the lab that we're going to start today is a little bit about, it relates to biodiversity, but also relates back to our unit on evolution, kind of brings us all together. So we'll be starting that in a few minutes. Any questions?